Commander Zykes stood before the massive holographic display in the war room of the Crimson Vengeance watching the data scroll past his 4 eyes. The Kethter had seen 3 centuries of warfare, his chitinous carapace bearing scars from 1,000 battles across the galaxy. Behind him, the most dangerous beings in known space sat around a circular table, each representing a different species, each a master of death in their own right. The Void Reapers had built their reputation on one simple principle. No contract was too dangerous, no target too well protected, no mission impossible. They had toppled governments, assassinated immortal beings, and conquered fortress worlds that had stood unconquered for millennia. Their fee was astronomical, but their success rate was perfect. 100% completion across 3,000 missions. Until today, the client is offering 50 million Imperial credits, Zykes announced, his translator converting his clicking mandibles into standard galactic. The target is a single settlement. Population, approximately 2,000. No military installations, no orbital defenses, no support from any major power. Around the table, the galaxy's deadliest killers shifted uncomfortably. Velter, the shadow-walking assassin from Nyx Prime, pulled her hood lower over her pale features. Her species could phase through solid matter and had perfected the art of killing without being detected. She had never failed to eliminate a target. "What's the catch?" rumbled Gorath, the massive Urghai warrior whose people had conquered 12 star systems through sheer brutality. His species stood 3 meters tall and could tear through reinforced steel with their bare hands. Nothing pays 50 million for a simple raid. Zykes' mandibles clicked nervously. In his long career, he had never seen his team react this way to a briefing. These beings feared nothing. Velter had assassinated the Quantum Emperor while he existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Gorath had single-handedly destroyed the Titan-class battleship Inevitable by boarding it and killing its entire crew of 5,000. Dr. Sectos, their Zithrak demolitions expert, had once collapsed a star to eliminate a target. Yet as he prepared to reveal the mission details, he could sense their growing unease. "The settlement," Zykes continued, "is located on Kepler 442b in the Outer Rim. It's classified as a Class 12 death world. The inhabitants are—" He paused, his translator struggling to process the next word. "Human." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Velter's pale hands clenched into fists. Gorath's massive frame tensed, his battle-scarred hide rippling with barely contained anxiety. Dr. Sectos made a sound that his species typically reserved for mourning their dead. "Humans," whispered Kurath, the psychic interrogator whose mental abilities could break the strongest minds in seconds. Her tentacled head writhed with agitation. "The client wants us to attack humans." Even Jenko, the cybernetic sniper who had never missed a shot across a career spanning 2 centuries, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Half his body had been replaced with precision machinery after a near-fatal encounter, but his remaining organic eye showed genuine fear. "I've reviewed the mission parameters 3 times, Zykes said, bringing up tactical displays of the settlement. "The humans have established a farming community. They grow food, raise livestock, build simple structures. According to our intelligence, they possess no weapons beyond basic hunting tools, no vehicles beyond simple ground transports, no communication systems capable of calling for reinforcement." The hologram showed aerial views of neat rows of crops, small dwellings built from local materials, and humans working in their fields. Children played in open areas while adults tended to their daily tasks. To any reasonable observer, it appeared to be exactly what it was: a peaceful farming settlement on a remote world, defenseless and isolated. "It's a trap," Gorath stated flatly. "Has to be. No one offers 50 million to kill farmers." "The client provided full genetic scans," Zykes replied, manipulating the display to show DNA analysis. 100% baseline human, no genetic modifications, no hidden cybernetics, no concealed weapons, just humans. Dr. Sectos spoke for the first time, his voice a series of musical tones that the translator rendered as speech. "Commander, with respect, I believe you misunderstand our concern. We're not worried about hidden traps or concealed weapons." His 4 arms gestured toward the display. "We're worried because they're human." Zykes' confusion was evident in the way his antennae twitched. As the newest member of the Void Reapers, having joined only 50 years ago, he had never encountered humans directly. His species, the Kethter, came from a world where conflict was ritualized and predictable. They understood honor, duty, and the clean logic of warfare. But humans were different. Perhaps, Velter said quietly, the commander would benefit from hearing our experiences. The others nodded grimly. These were beings who had faced the worst the galaxy had to offer. They had survived wars that lasted centuries, battled creatures that existed beyond the normal dimensions of space and time, and emerged victorious from conflicts that had destroyed entire civilizations. Yet the thought of facing a peaceful human settlement filled them with dread. Velter, Zykes said, "You've encountered humans before." The shadow assassin nodded slowly. Once, it was supposed to be a simple elimination, a human diplomat who was negotiating a peace treaty between two warring species. The contract was worth 5 million credits, and my employer wanted it to look like an accident. She paused, her pale fingers tracing old scars that were barely visible beneath her tactical suit. The target was staying in a luxury hotel on Centauri Prime. Maximum security, but nothing I couldn't handle. I phased through 17 different barriers, bypassed detection systems that should have been impossible to fool, and entered his suite while he slept. Around the table, the other mercenaries leaned forward. They knew Velter's reputation. When she accepted a contract, the target was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. He was lying in bed, completely defenseless, a middle-aged human male, slightly overweight, wearing simple sleeping clothes. No weapons, no guards in the immediate vicinity, no way he could have known I was there. Velter's voice grew quieter. I materialized next to his bed and raised my quantum blade to strike. The room was silent, except for the hum of the ship's engines. He opened his eyes and smiled at me, not startled, not afraid. He smiled and said, "Good evening, Velter of Nyx Prime. I've been expecting you." Zykes felt his exoskeleton crawling with unease. "How did he know your name? Your species keeps no records of individual assassins." That's what I demanded to know. He sat up in bed, completely calm, and began talking. He told me about my childhood on Nyx Prime, about the training academy where I learned to phase through matter, about my first kill when I was barely out of adolescence. He knew about missions I had completed that weren't in any official records, contracts that my own guild had classified beyond top secret. She looked around the table at her fellow mercenaries. Then he told me about my sister. The reaction from the others was immediate. Several species represented around the table had cultural taboos about family members being mentioned during combat situations. For Velter's people, family connections were considered sacred and were never discussed with outsiders. My sister had died in a training accident 50 years earlier. It was classified as a state secret because her death revealed a flaw in our phasing technology that could have been exploited by enemies. Only 3 people knew the real circumstances of her death, and 2 of them were dead. Velter's hands were shaking now, something that would have been unthinkable for an assassin of her caliber under normal circumstances. He described the accident in perfect detail. He told me how she had tried to phase through a quantum-locked barrier and had been trapped between dimensions. He knew how long she had suffered before dying. He knew her last words. Her voice broke slightly. Words that only I had heard. The weight of her revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Gorath's massive hands clenched into fists. "What did you do?" I asked him how he could possibly know these things. He explained that humans have a particular talent for gathering information, not through technology or psychic abilities, but through something they call research. He told me that when the peace negotiations had begun 6 months earlier, his security team had compiled detailed files on every potential threat. She gestured helplessly. They had investigated every assassin, every mercenary company, every criminal organization that might be hired to eliminate him. They had spent months learning everything there was to know about every possible enemy. Not just professional capabilities, but personal histories, psychological profiles, family connections, fears, motivations. Dr. Sectos made another morning sound. His species understood the concept of thorough preparation, but what Velter was describing went far beyond normal tactical planning. He knew about all of us, Velter continued. Every member of every guild that might be contracted to kill him. He had files on our techniques, our equipment, our preferred methods of operation. He knew our real names, our home worlds, our family members. But knowing about an assassin isn't the same as stopping one, Gorath pointed out. "You still could have killed him." Velter laughed bitterly. "That's what I thought. I told him that all his research wouldn't save him from a quantum blade through the heart. You know what he said." Around the table, 6 of the galaxy's deadliest killers waited for her answer. He said, "You're absolutely right, Velter. If you choose to kill me, I can't stop you. But before you do, would you like to know why your sister really died?" The silence stretched for long moments before Zykst finally spoke. What did he mean? "It wasn't an accident." Velter's voice was barely above a whisper. "The quantum barrier she tried to phase through had been deliberately modified. Someone had wanted to test whether our phasing abilities could be countered. My sister was murdered to gather data for a weapons program." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Velter had spent 50 years believing her sister had died due to a training accident, had carried guilt over not being able to save her, had shaped her entire career around ensuring she never made the same mistake. The human had spent months investigating not just my capabilities, but my personal history. He had uncovered a 50-year-old conspiracy that my own people had covered up. He knew who had ordered my sister's death, why they had done it, and what they had gained from her murder. She looked directly at Zykst. "He offered me a choice. I could kill him and complete my contract, or I could let him live and he would help me get justice for my sister. Not just the name of the person who ordered her death, but evidence that would stand up in a court of law. Video records, financial transactions, communications between the conspirators." "What did you choose?" Zykst asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I lowered my weapon." He kept his promise. Within 6 months, the conspiracy was exposed. 7 high-ranking officials from my home world were arrested and executed for murder. My sister was officially declared a hero whose death had helped expose corruption in our government. The story hung in the air like a challenge to everything the mercenaries thought they understood about their profession. They dealt in violence and death, in straightforward applications of force and fear. But humans, it seemed, operated on an entirely different level. "That's why you've never completed a contract involving humans since then," Gorath observed. Velter nodded. "Every time a human-related contract comes up, I remember that hotel room. I remember a man who turned my own mission into a weapon against people who had wronged my family. I remember someone who understood me better than I understood myself." The room fell silent again as the implications of her story sank in. These were beings who had built their careers on being unpredictable, on being the hunters rather than the hunted. The idea that someone could know them so thoroughly, could turn their own motivations against them, was terrifying. But Velter's story was just the beginning. Gorath cleared his massive throat, drawing attention away from Velter's haunted expression. The HFY warrior had remained silent during the assassin's tale, but now his scarred features showed the weight of his own memories. When he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "My encounter was different," he began, his massive hands clasped on the table before him, "but no less educational." Zykes turned his attention to the giant warrior, noting how Gorath's usual aggressive posture had shifted into something more defensive. The HFY were known throughout the galaxy as the ultimate warriors, a species that had evolved in constant warfare and had never been defeated in direct combat. Yet something about humans had clearly left its mark on even this unstoppable force. 18 years ago, I received a contract from the Stellar Consortium," Gorath continued. "They wanted me to eliminate a human military unit that had been interfering with their mining operations on Zirian VII. The payment was substantial, but more importantly, they offered me something I had wanted for decades." He paused, his small eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the holographic display. Combat footage of human soldiers in action. The consortium had been studying human military tactics for years, trying to understand why such a physically weak species had been so successful in their expansion across the galaxy. They offered to share their research if I completed the contract. Dr. Sectos tilted his elongated head, his 4 arms gesturing in curiosity. "Your people had not encountered humans in battle before." Gorath shook his massive head. "The HFY territories were far from human space. We had heard stories, of course. Rumors about how humans had defeated the Korthak Empire, how they had forced the Zentari hegemony into a peace treaty, how they had somehow convinced the Ethereal Council to grant them voting rights." He snorted. "We dismissed these stories as propaganda. Humans are small, weak, short-lived creatures. How could they possibly stand against species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia? The irony in his voice was unmistakable. Around the table, the other mercenaries nodded in understanding. They had all once shared similar assumptions about human capabilities. The target was a single company of human soldiers, Gorath continued. Approximately 200 individuals stationed on a remote mining world to protect the interests of indigenous species. The consortium's intelligence indicated they were armed with standard human military equipment, nothing that should have posed a threat to an HFY warrior. Zyxt examined the tactical display, trying to imagine how 200 humans could present any meaningful challenge to a being capable of tearing through starship hull plating with his bare hands. I approached the planet openly, Gorath said. HFY do not skulk in shadows or rely on deception. I announced my presence and challenged their commander to single combat, as is traditional among my people. The winner would determine the fate of the human unit. Single combat, Velter murmured. You gave them a chance to face you honorably. I gave them the only chance I thought they deserved, Gorath corrected grimly. The human commander accepted my challenge, a woman named Colonel Sarah Chen. She was perhaps half my height and probably 1/10 my body weight. When I saw her walk onto the designated combat ground, I almost called off the entire contract. His expression grew distant. She looked like a child playing at being a soldier. Her equipment was lightweight, designed for mobility rather than protection. Her weapon was a simple projectile rifle, the kind of primitive technology my people had abandoned centuries ago. She moved with precision, but there was no way her physical strength could match mine. Jenko, the cybernetic sniper, leaned forward with interest. His mechanical eye whirred as it focused on Gorath's massive form. What happened when combat began? She spoke to me first, Gorath replied. In perfect HFY battle dialect, she recited the traditional pre-combat prayers of my people. Not just the words, but the proper inflections, the ceremonial timing, the subtle variations that indicate respect for a worthy opponent. The significance of this wasn't lost on anyone around the table. The HFY battle dialect was considered one of the most complex linguistic systems in the galaxy, with subtle meanings that changed based on tone, timing, and context. For an outsider to learn it well enough to perform ceremonial functions would require years of dedicated study. Then she did something unexpected, Gorath continued. She set down her rifle and removed her armor. She told me that she understood HFY honor codes and that she wanted our combat to be conducted according to my traditions rather than human military doctrine. Dr. Sectos made a sound of disbelief. She disarmed herself against an HFY warrior. Completely, she stood before me wearing only her basic uniform, carrying nothing but a combat knife. Then she spoke the ritual of recognition. The ritual of recognition was something that existed only in the most formal HFY combat traditions, reserved for battles between legendary warriors. It was a way of acknowledging that the coming fight would be remembered in the histories of their people. I was confused, Gorath admitted. No one had spoken those words to me before. Even among my own people, the ritual of recognition was considered archaic, reserved for heroes of legend. Yet this small human woman was treating our combat as if it were the most important battle of our respective careers. Zyxt found himself leaning forward despite his growing unease. How did the fight proceed? Gorath was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands clenching and unclenching. It lasted 17 hours. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. HFY combat was typically measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. Their overwhelming physical advantages usually ended battles before opponents could mount any meaningful resistance. 17 hours, Gorath repeated. She never tried to match my strength. She never attempted to overpower me or engage me in direct physical confrontation. Instead, she fought a battle of endurance, patience, and precision. He stood up from his chair, his massive frame casting shadows across the war room. Every time I charged her, she was somewhere else. Not through superior speed, but through superior positioning. She had studied the terrain of our combat ground and had identified dozens of advantages I had never noticed. Rocks that could trip an unwary fighter, patches of loose soil that would shift under heavy weight, angles of sunlight that could blind or dazzle. Velter nodded slowly. She turned the environment into a weapon. More than that, Gorath said. She turned my own advantages against me. My strength became a liability when she led me into areas where powerful strikes would destabilize the ground beneath my feet. My size became a disadvantage when she maneuvered me into spaces where I couldn't use my full range of motion. My aggressive nature became a weakness when she baited me into attacks that left me exposed and off balance. The giant warrior began packing, his movements betraying an agitation that his fellow mercenaries had never seen before. But the most disturbing part wasn't her tactical superiority, he continued. It was her psychological warfare. As we fought, she spoke to me, not taunts or threats, but observations. She told me about my training, about the specific techniques I had learned from different masters. She identified the fighting styles I was using and predicted which combinations I would employ next. Kurath, the psychic interrogator, made a sound of interest. Her tentacled head writhed as she processed the implications. She was reading your combat patterns. More than that, she was reading my mind, not psychically, but through pure observation and analysis. She told me about battles I had fought years earlier, describing my tactics and movements in detail. She knew about techniques I had never used in public, strategies I had developed in private training sessions. Gorath stopped packing and turned to face the group. Halfway through our fight, I realized she wasn't trying to defeat me. She was studying me. Every attack I made, every defense I mounted, every tactical decision I implemented was being cataloged and analyzed. She was using our combat as a learning experience. The implications were staggering. The idea that someone could turn a life-or-death battle into an educational opportunity required a level of confidence and tactical thinking that bordered on the impossible. "How did the fight end?" Zykes asked. Gorath's expression grew thoughtful. "After 17 hours, I was exhausted, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. I had thrown everything I had at her, used every technique in my arsenal, employed every trick I had learned in 3 centuries of warfare, and she had countered all of it." He sat back down, his massive frame settling into the chair with obvious weariness. Finally, she stopped moving. She stood in the center of our combat ground and waited for me to approach. When I reached her, she spoke the ritual of honorable conclusion. The ritual of honorable conclusion was another archaic Urghai tradition, used when 2 warriors had fought to the point where continuing would serve no purpose except mutual destruction. She told me that our combat had been a privilege, that she had learned much about Urghai tactics and culture, and that she hoped our encounter would lead to greater understanding between our species. Gorath looked around the table at his fellow mercenaries. Then she offered me a proposition. She said that the Stellar Consortium had hired me to eliminate her unit, but that they hadn't been entirely honest about their goals. The mining operation I was supposed to protect was strip mining sacred burial grounds of the native species. The humans weren't interfering with legitimate business. They were preventing cultural genocide. The room fell silent as the parallels with Velter's story became clear. Once again, humans had turned a straightforward military engagement into something far more complex. She offered to show me the evidence. Geological surveys proving that the consortium knew they were destroying irreplaceable cultural sites. Communication records showing that they had deliberately targeted sacred locations because the native species would be too devastated to resist. Financial documents proving that the entire operation was designed to drive the indigenous population off their homeworld so the consortium could claim territorial rights. Dr. Sectos whistled softly, a sound his translator rendered as dismay. "They provided you with intelligence against your own employers." "Complete intelligence," Gorath confirmed. "Financial records, communication intercepts, geological data, cultural significance reports, everything needed to understand the full scope of the consortium's deception. But more than that, they offered me something else." He paused, his expression growing almost reverent. "Colonel Chen told me that her unit's cultural specialist had been studying Urghai history and had discovered evidence that my own family line had been deliberately eliminated by the consortium 50 years earlier." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Jenko's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused intently on Gorath's massive form. "My family had been investigating consortium mining operations in Urghai space," Gorath continued. "They had discovered evidence of illegal resource extraction and had prepared to expose the conspiracy. Before they could act, their transport ship suffered a systems failure that killed all aboard." his hands clenched into fists that could crush starship bulkheads. Colonel Chen provided me with the maintenance records from my family's ship, records that showed deliberate sabotage. She gave me the names of the technicians who had been bribed to install faulty systems. She showed me communication logs proving that consortium executives had ordered my family's deaths. Velter leaned back in her chair, understanding dawning in her pale features. She offered you the same choice she had offered me. Gorath nodded grimly. I could complete my contract and eliminate her unit, or I could let them live and help them expose the consortium's crimes. But she added something else. She said that if I chose to help them, her government would provide me with the resources to hunt down everyone responsible for my family's murders. The weight of the offer was staggering. For an HFY warrior, family honor was everything. The opportunity to avenge murdered relatives would supersede almost any other consideration. I chose revenge, Gorath said simply. Within 6 months, the consortium's illegal mining operations were exposed to the Galactic Council. 17 executives were arrested for war crimes. The technicians who had sabotaged my family's ship were tried and executed according to HFY law. He looked around the table at his fellow mercenaries. But the most important part wasn't the justice. It was the realization. That human colonel had spent months studying not just my combat capabilities, but my personal history, my cultural background, my family connections. She had investigated a 50-year-old conspiracy and uncovered evidence that my own people's intelligence services had missed. Zykst felt his exoskeleton crawling with the same unease he had experienced during Velter's story. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than any enemy he had ever faced. She had known from the beginning that you wouldn't complete the contract, he said. She had known that if I learned the truth about my family's deaths, I would turn against the people who had hired me. She had spent months gathering evidence not because she hoped to convince me, but because she knew she would convince me. The implications were staggering. These weren't lucky guesses or fortunate coincidences. The humans had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond normal tactical planning. That's why I've never taken another contract involving humans, Gorath concluded. Because I realized that every time someone hires us to fight them, we're not really fighting humans. We're fighting people who understand us better than we understand ourselves. Dr. Sectos shifted in his specially designed chair, his 4 arms moving in complex patterns that indicated deep thought among his species. The Zithrak demolitions expert had remained silent during the previous stories, but now his musical tones filled the war room as he prepared to share his own encounter with humanity. My experience, he began, his translator converting his harmonic speech into standard galactic, was perhaps more disturbing than either of yours because it involved no direct confrontation whatsoever. Zykes found himself dreading what was to come. If Velter's story had demonstrated human intelligence gathering capabilities, and Gorath's had shown their strategic thinking, what could have shaken a being whose specialty was destroying entire installations with mathematical precision? Dr. Sectos gestured with 2 of his arms toward the holographic display, calling up technical specifications that appeared to be architectural plans. 12 years ago, I was contracted by the hegemony of Zorth to eliminate a human research facility on the edge of their territory. The facility was supposedly developing weapons technology that threatened hegemony security. The plans showed a sprawling complex built into the side of a mountain, with multiple levels extending deep underground. Even to Zykst's inexperienced eye, it looked like a formidable target. The payment was exceptional, Dr. Sectos continued. But more importantly, the hegemony offered me access to their quantum demolition laboratories. For a demolitions specialist, this was equivalent to offering a musician access to instruments that could create symphonies impossible with conventional technology. Kurath's tentacles writhed with interest. Quantum demolitions? I thought such technology was purely theoretical. The Zorth had been developing it for centuries, Dr. Sectos explained. The ability to collapse molecular bonds at the subatomic level, to disintegrate matter without creating explosive force. It was the ultimate expression of controlled destruction. He manipulated the display to show detailed scans of the human facility's defenses. According to hegemony intelligence, the facility was lightly defended. Approximately 50 human researchers and a minimal security force. No heavy weapons, no energy shields, no orbital defense platforms. The hegemony had been monitoring the facility for months and had detected no significant military activity. Velter frowned, her pale features showing concern. You suspected deception. Initially, no, Dr. Sectos admitted. The intelligence appeared thorough and accurate. The hegemony provided detailed architectural plans, security schedules, personnel rosters, supply manifests. Everything indicated a straightforward demolition operation against a poorly defended target. He paused, his four arms moving in a pattern that indicated regret among his species. I spent weeks studying the facility and preparing my approach. The Zithrak pride themselves on precision. We don't simply destroy targets, we engineer their destruction with mathematical elegance. Every explosion is calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. Gorath leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. What made this target different? The communications, Dr. Sectos replied. 3 days before I was scheduled to begin the operation, I intercepted a transmission from the facility to Earth. He manipulated the holographic display again, showing what appeared to be a routine scientific report. It was addressed to the Human Colonial Science Council, requesting additional funding for their research project. But the content, he trailed off, his musical tones becoming discordant. They were requesting funding to study Zithrak demolition techniques. The room fell silent except for the hum of the ship's engines. The report detailed my previous operations with remarkable accuracy, Dr. Sectos continued. They knew about the Zirian station demolition, where I had collapsed a 3-kilometer structure using only 17 precisely placed charges. They knew about the asteroid mining platform incident, where I had triggered a controlled chain reaction that destroyed an entire facility while leaving neighboring structures untouched. Zykes felt his mandibles clicking nervously. They were studying your work. More than studying, Dr. Sectos corrected. They were analyzing it. The report included mathematical models of my explosion patterns, chemical analysis of my preferred demolition compounds, timing calculations based on my previous operations. They had reverse-engineered my techniques from examining the results of my missions. Jenko's cybernetic eye whirred as it processed the implications. They were preparing for your attack. That's what I assumed, Dr. Sectos said. I believed they had somehow learned about the contract and were preparing defenses. But as I continued monitoring their communications, I discovered something far more unsettling. He gestured toward the display, which now showed a series of scientific papers published in human academic journals. They weren't preparing defenses. They were conducting academic research. The facility wasn't developing weapons at all. They were studying the mathematical principles underlying demolition techniques used by various galactic species. The revelation was met with stunned silence. The research was entirely theoretical, Dr. Sectos continued. They were investigating whether the demolition methods developed by different species could be combined to create more efficient construction techniques. They wanted to understand how controlled destruction could be used for beneficial purposes. Velter shook her head in disbelief. They were turning military demolition techniques into civilian engineering applications. Precisely. They had studied the work of demolition specialists from 17 different species and were developing new methods of precision excavation, controlled mining, and architectural modification. The weapons research that the hegemony was so concerned about was actually a project to build better cities. Dr. Sectos manipulated the display to show architectural plans that incorporated demolition techniques as construction tools. But that wasn't the most disturbing part, he continued. As I studied their research, I began to understand that they hadn't just analyzed my previous work, they had analyzed me. Gorath's scarred features showed confusion. What do you mean? The mathematical models they had developed didn't just predict how I would destroy a structure. They predicted how I would approach the problem of destroying their facility. They had calculated the most likely infiltration routes I would use, the optimal placement points for my charges, the timing sequences I would employ. The implications were staggering. It was one thing to study past operations. It was entirely different to predict future ones. I decided to test their calculations, Dr. Sectos said. I approached the facility using a completely different methodology than what their models predicted. Instead of my usual precision approach, I employed the crude but effective techniques favored by Gornak's demolition teams. He paused, his four arms moving in patterns that indicated deep unease. Their security systems were configured to detect Gornak-style approaches. When I used Caltharian stealth techniques instead of my normal Zithrak methods, their sensors were calibrated for Caltharian technology. No matter what approach I attempted, they had prepared countermeasures. Kurath's tentacles writhed with agitation. They had predicted multiple scenarios. They had predicted every scenario, Dr. Sectos corrected. I spent 2 weeks attempting different approaches, using techniques borrowed from dozens of different species. Every time, their defenses were prepared for exactly the method I had chosen. The room was silent, as the mercenaries absorbed the full significance of what they were hearing. Finally, I abandoned all attempts at stealth and approached the facility openly, Dr. Sectos continued. I announced my presence and requested a meeting with their research director. To my surprise, they invited me inside. Velter leaned forward with interest. They welcomed a demolitions expert who had been sent to destroy their facility. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the research director, greeted me personally. She explained that they had been expecting my visit for months, not because they knew about the contract, but because their mathematical models predicted that someone with my capabilities would eventually be hired to investigate their research. Dr. Sectos's musical tones became almost reverential. She offered to show me their work, not as a potential enemy, but as a professional colleague. They had developed demolition techniques that surpassed anything I had imagined possible. He manipulated the display to show video recordings of controlled demolitions that defied conventional understanding. They had learned to trigger molecular collapse in specific patterns, creating destruction that was not only mathematically precise, but artistically beautiful. They showed me buildings that had been disassembled rather than destroyed, with every component carefully preserved for reuse. The videos showed structures dissolving in cascading waves, collapsing inward with geometric precision that resembled complex mathematical equations made physical. But the most remarkable part was their attitude toward my presence, Dr. Sectos continued. Dr. Harper explained that they had hoped someone like me would come to see their work. They wanted to share their discoveries with the galaxy's premier demolition specialists. Gorath shook his massive head. They wanted to collaborate with someone who had been sent to kill them. They wanted to learn, Dr. Sectos corrected. Dr. Harper told me that human science advances through collaboration and knowledge sharing. They believed that by combining their theoretical research with my practical experience, they could develop techniques that would benefit everyone. The alien concept of voluntary knowledge sharing clearly disturbed several of the mercenaries. In their experience, technological advantages were jealously guarded and used as weapons against competitors. She offered me a position, Dr. Sectos said quietly. A permanent research position with unlimited funding and access to technologies I had never dreamed possible. The opportunity to push the boundaries of controlled destruction beyond anything that had been achieved before. Zyx found himself asking the question he dreaded to hear answered. What did you choose? I spent 3 days touring their facility, Dr. Sectos replied. They showed me research projects that redefined my understanding of physics, engineering, and mathematics. They introduced me to concepts that made my previous work seem primitive by comparison. His four arms gestured toward the display, which now showed equations that hurt to look at directly. But more than that, they showed me why the hegemony of Zorth had really wanted their facility destroyed. The humans weren't developing weapons. They were developing construction techniques that would make hegemony architectural technology obsolete. The pieces began falling into place. Velter nodded grimly. Economic warfare disguised as military necessity. The hegemony controlled galactic construction technology through monopolistic practices. Their techniques were inferior but protected by patents and enforced through political pressure. The human research threatened to make their entire industry obsolete. Dr. Sectos manipulated the display to show economic projections that painted a stark picture. If human construction techniques became widely available, the hegemony would lose trillions of credits in revenue. Entire Zorth industrial worlds would become economically unviable overnight. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar. Once again, the mercenaries had been hired not to eliminate a legitimate threat, but to protect someone's economic interests through violence. Dr. Harper showed me the evidence, Dr. Sectos continued. Communication records proving that hegemony executives had deliberately misrepresented human research as weapons development. Financial documents showing that they had hired the Void Reapers specifically because our reputation would lend credibility to their claims of a security threat. Kureth made a sound of disgust. They were using our reputation as propaganda. More than that, Dr. Harper explained that the hegemony had been planning to use my attack on their facility as justification for a broader military action against human space. They would claim that human weapons research posed an existential threat that required immediate intervention. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. The mercenaries hadn't just been hired to destroy a facility. They had been hired to provide a pretense for interstellar war. What convinced me to abandon the contract wasn't the technological opportunities, Dr. Sectos said. It was the realization that Dr. Harper had known from the beginning that I would make this choice. He looked around the table at his fellow mercenaries. She had calculated not just my demolition techniques, but my psychological profile. She knew that once I understood the true nature of the research, once I saw the mathematical beauty of their work, once I realized the scope of the hegemony's deception, I would choose collaboration over destruction. The admission hung in the air like an indictment. She had known for months that I would walk into their facility, see their research, and decide to help them expose the hegemony's conspiracy. She had prepared for my arrival not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a colleague to be recruited. Dr. Sectos's forearms moved in a gesture that indicated profound respect. That's when I realized that fighting humans isn't about matching their military capabilities or technological resources. It's about competing with minds that can predict our actions, understand our motivations, and turn our own decisions into weapons against the people who hire us. Zyxt felt his exoskeleton crawling with a fear he had never experienced before. The pattern was clear now, and it was more terrifying than any enemy he could imagine. Humans didn't just fight wars. They fought wars inside the minds of their opponents. Kureth slowly extended her tentacled appendages, the psychic interrogator's movements betraying an uncharacteristic nervousness. Among her species, mental contact was as natural as breathing, and she had spent centuries perfecting the art of breaking the strongest minds in the galaxy. Yet as she prepared to share her own encounter with humans, her psychic emanations radiated an unease that her fellow mercenaries could sense even without telepathic abilities. "My story," she began, her mental voice translating through the ship systems with unusual hesitation, "involves no physical combat, no demolition, no investigation of conspiracies. What the humans did to me was far more personal." Zyx noticed that the other mercenaries instinctively shifted away from Kurath as she spoke. Her species' psychic abilities made most other beings uncomfortable under normal circumstances. But now there was something different about her mental emanations, something that suggested damage that went deeper than physical wounds. 8 years ago, I was contracted by the Nexus Syndicate to extract information from a human prisoner, Kureth continued. The target was a civilian scientist named Dr. Michael Tors who had been captured while conducting unauthorized research in Syndicate space. She manipulated the holographic display to show the image of a middle-aged human male with graying hair and tired eyes. To Zykst's inexperienced assessment, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a harmless academic who had wandered into dangerous territory. The Syndicate believed Dr. Tors possessed the location coordinates of a lost human colony ship that had disappeared centuries earlier, Kureth explained. The ship was rumored to contain technological archives that would be worth billions of credits on the black market. Velter frowned, her pale features showing confusion. A simple information extraction from a civilian target, that should have been routine for someone with your abilities. Kureth's tentacles writhed with what appeared to be embarrassment. That's what I believed. Dr. Tors was being held in a maximum security detention facility on Kepler Station. Standard procedure for psychic interrogation. Isolate the subject, establish mental contact, break down psychological defenses, extract required information. She paused, her psychic emanations growing more disturbed. I began the interrogation using standard techniques. Light psychic pressure to establish dominance, followed by deeper mental probing to locate the information I needed. Dr. Torres offered no resistance. His mind was completely open to my intrusion. Goreth leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. No resistance at all. That's unusual for someone with valuable information. More than unusual, Kureth agreed. In my experience, even untrained minds have natural defenses against psychic intrusion. Subconscious barriers, emotional responses, instinctive rejection of foreign mental presence. But Dr. Torres seemed to welcome my contact. Dr. Sectos made a sound of interest, his musical tones conveying curiosity. He was cooperating voluntarily. That's what I initially believed, Kureth said. He answered every question I asked, provided detailed information about his research, shared personal memories with remarkable clarity. Within hours, I had extracted everything the Syndicate wanted to know. She manipulated the display to show star charts with several systems highlighted in red. The colony ship was located in the Kepler 1649 system, hidden in the asteroid belt surrounding the fourth planet. Dr. Torres provided precise coordinates, access codes for the ship systems, even detailed inventories of the technological archives stored in its data banks. Zyx examined the star charts, noting the level of detail in the information. The extraction was successful then. Kureth's psychic emanations suddenly spiked with distress. That's what I reported to the Syndicate, but as I prepared to disconnect from Dr. Tor's mind, something unexpected happened. The room fell silent as the mercenaries waited for her to continue. He began talking to me, not with his voice but directly through our mental link. He thanked me for the conversation and said he hoped I had learned something useful from our exchange. Velter's pale features showed alarm. He was speaking to you psychically. Humans don't have telepathic abilities. That's what I had always believed, Kureth said quietly. But Dr. Torres explained that humans have developed techniques for communicating with telepathic species, not through natural psychic ability, but through understanding how psychic contact functions. She gestured toward the display, which now showed complex diagrams of neural pathways. He told me that human neuroscientists had spent decades studying telepathic species, learning to recognize the patterns of psychic intrusion, and developing methods for conscious interaction during mental contact. The implications were disturbing. The idea that a non-psychic species could learn to communicate through telepathic channels suggested a level of scientific advancement that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and mental abilities. But the conversation itself wasn't what disturbed me, Kureth continued. It was what Dr. Torres chose to discuss. He began asking me questions about my own experiences, my personal history, my motivations for choosing a career in psychic interrogation. Gorath's scarred features showed confusion. He interrogated you while you were interrogating him. More than that, Kureth replied. As he asked his questions, I found myself answering them, not because he was compelling me to respond, but because I wanted to share my thoughts with him. The admission clearly disturbed her. For a psychic interrogator, losing control of a mental conversation was equivalent to a warrior dropping their weapon in the middle of combat. Dr. Torres was genuinely interested in my perspective, Kureth explained. He asked about my childhood on Zeta Reticuli, about my early training in psychic techniques, about my first successful interrogation. He listened to my answers with the kind of attention that I had never experienced before. She paused, her tentacles moving in patterns that indicated deep emotional disturbance. You have to understand, she said. My species views psychic interrogation as a necessary but unpleasant profession. Other telepaths consider what I do to be a violation of everything our abilities were meant to accomplish. I have spent centuries being feared, avoided, and condemned by my own people. Jenko's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on Kureth's distressed form. Dr. Torres didn't judge your profession. He was fascinated by it, Kureth replied. He asked detailed questions about psychic techniques, about the ethics of mental intrusion, about how I balanced the necessity of my work with respect for other consciousness. He treated my profession as if it were a legitimate field of study worthy of academic consideration. The contrast with her usual experience was clearly significant. For someone who had spent centuries being treated as a necessary evil, Finding acceptance and genuine interest would be powerfully affecting. But as our conversation continued, Kureth said, I began to realize that Dr. Torres knew things about my personal history that I hadn't shared with him. He knew about my family's reaction when I chose my profession. He knew about the isolation I experienced among my own people. He knew about contracts I had accepted that still troubled my conscience. The familiar pattern was emerging again. Velter nodded grimly, recognizing the signs. He had researched you before the interrogation, she said. Extensively, Kureth confirmed, but not through conventional intelligence gathering. Dr. Torres explained that he had spent months studying psychic interrogation techniques used by various species. As part of his research, he had investigated the professional and personal histories of the galaxy's most skilled practitioners. She gestured helplessly with her tentacles. He knew about every major interrogation I had conducted, every technique I had perfected, every moral compromise I had made in the service of my clients. He understood my work better than some of my own colleagues. Dr. Sectos made a sound that his translator rendered as amazement. He had turned the interrogation into a research opportunity. More than that, Kureth said. As our conversation progressed, I began to understand that Dr. Torres had deliberately allowed himself to be captured. The entire situation had been engineered to bring us into contact. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The colony ship information was accurate, Kureth continued. The coordinates, the access codes, the inventory data, everything I extracted was genuine. But Dr. Torres had discovered the ship years earlier and had been waiting for the right opportunity to reveal its location. Zeixt felt his mandibles clicking nervously. Why would he want the Syndicate to find the ship? Because the technological archives weren't what the Syndicate expected to find, Kureth explained. The colony ship contained detailed records of human expansion into the galaxy, including documentation of every illegal activity the Syndicate had conducted in human space over the past 2 centuries. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Once again, the Mercenaries had been used as unwitting tools in a larger human strategy. Dr. Torres had spent years gathering evidence of Syndicate crimes, Kureth continued. But he needed a way to ensure the evidence would be discovered by galactic authorities without being able to trace the leak back to human intelligence services. Velter shook her head in amazement. So he let himself be captured, knowing that the Syndicate would hire you to extract information from him. He had studied my professional history and knew that I was honorable despite the nature of my work, Kureth said. He knew that once I understood the true scope of what we had discovered, I would feel obligated to ensure the evidence reached the proper authorities. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity. Dr. Torres had engineered his own capture, endured imprisonment and psychic interrogation, all to position the evidence where it would be discovered and acted upon. But the most disturbing part, Kureth continued, was what he offered me personally. During our mental connection, he showed me research that human scientists had conducted into psychic rehabilitation techniques. She manipulated the display to show medical journals and research papers. Humans had developed methods for helping telepaths who had been traumatized by their experiences with psychic interrogation. They understood that forcing one consciousness to violate another leaves permanent damage on both minds. Kureth's tentacles moved in patterns that indicated deep emotional pain. Dr. Torres offered me the chance to learn these techniques, not as a client seeking treatment, but as a practitioner who could help others who had suffered similar trauma. He offered me the opportunity to use my abilities to heal minds instead of breaking them. The offer represented something that Kureth had never imagined possible: redemption for a lifetime of necessary violations. "What did you choose?" Goreth asked quietly. Kureth's psychic emanations grew calm for the first time since she had begun her story. "I chose to help him complete his mission," she said. "I ensured that the evidence from the colony's ship reached the Galactic Justice Council. 17 Syndicate executives were arrested within 6 months. Their illegal operations were shut down, and their victims received compensation for damages." She looked around the table at her fellow mercenaries. "But more importantly, I learned that Dr. Torres had known from the beginning that I would make this choice. He had studied my psychological profile so thoroughly that he knew exactly how I would respond to his offer." The admission carried the weight of profound revelation. He had engineered the entire operation around his understanding of my character, Kurath continued. He knew that I was troubled by the moral implications of my work. He knew that I wanted to find a way to use my abilities for constructive purposes. He knew that if he offered me a chance at redemption, I would take it regardless of the personal cost. Zykes realized that the pattern was complete now. Every story had demonstrated the same fundamental truth about human capabilities. He had predicted your psychological response, he said. He had predicted everyone's psychological response, Kurath corrected. The Syndicate's greed, my moral flexibility, the Justice Council's political motivations, even the reactions of the various species whose representatives would evaluate the evidence. Her tentacles writhed with a mixture of admiration and fear. Dr. Torres had engineered a plan that required dozens of different beings to make specific choices at precise moments. And he had been confident enough in his understanding of galactic psychology to risk his own life on the assumption that everyone would behave exactly as he predicted. The room fell silent as the full implications of the story settled over the mercenaries. They were beings who prided themselves on being unpredictable, on being wild cards that could not be anticipated or controlled. Yet the humans had demonstrated the ability to understand and manipulate their psychology with mathematical precision. That's why I've never accepted another contract involving humans, Kurath concluded. Because I realized that every time we think we're hunting them, we're actually being hunted by minds that understand us better than we understand ourselves. Jenko, who had remained silent throughout all the stories, finally spoke, his cybernetic eye word as it focused on each of his fellow mercenaries in turn. Perhaps, he said quietly, it's time I shared what I discovered about human warfare capabilities. Jenko's cybernetic implants hummed softly as he accessed archived data files, his mechanical eye casting a red glow across the war room. The sniper's organic half showed the weight of memories that clearly disturbed him, while his cybernetic components displayed tactical analyses with cold precision. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat emotional tone that he had adopted after his transformation. My encounter with humans, he began, cost me everything I was and made me into what I am now. The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Around the table, the other mercenaries shifted uncomfortably as they realized that Jenko's extensive cybernetic modifications weren't just enhancements, but replacements for destroyed organic systems. 15 years ago, I was hired by the Caltharian Military Council to eliminate a human sniper who had been disrupting their operations in the Centauri conflict, Jenko continued. The target was identified as Staff Sergeant Lisa Park, attached to the Human Colonial Defense Force. He manipulated the holographic display to show a tactical overview of a war zone that sprawled across multiple star systems. The Centauri conflict had been one of the bloodiest military engagements in recent galactic history, with multiple species fighting for control of strategic territory. The Caltharians were frustrated because a single human sniper was neutralizing their tactical advantages, Jenko explained. Staff Sergeant Park had eliminated over 200 high-value targets, including field commanders, communications specialists, and heavy weapons operators. Zykes studied the tactical data, noting the scope of the engagement. A single sniper was affecting the outcome of an entire military campaign. More than affecting, Jenko corrected. She was systematically dismantling the Caltharian command structure. Every shot was precisely calculated to cause maximum disruption to enemy operations. She wasn't just killing targets, she was destroying the enemy's ability to coordinate their forces. Dr. Sectos made a sound of professional interest. Precision targeting with strategic impact. Beyond anything I had seen before, Jenko confirmed. I studied her work for weeks before accepting the contract. Every elimination was a masterpiece of tactical thinking. She would identify targets whose deaths would create cascading failures in enemy operations. He highlighted specific data points on the display, showing how individual eliminations had led to communication breakdowns, supply disruptions, and command confusion. For example, she identified a Caltharian logistics officer whose death would strand 3 entire battalions without ammunition resupply. But instead of killing him immediately, she waited until he was in the middle of coordinating a major offensive. His death at that precise moment caused the entire attack to collapse. Velter leaned forward with interest. She was timing her kills for maximum psychological impact. She was orchestrating the enemy's defeat one shot at a time, Jenko replied. Each elimination was part of a larger strategic plan that spanned weeks or months. She was fighting a war of mathematics and probability. His cybernetic eye whirred as it accessed additional data files. The Caltharians offered me a substantial fee to eliminate her, but more importantly, they provided me with complete tactical intelligence about her operations. Surveillance data, ballistic analysis, position tracking, communication intercepts. Everything needed to predict her movements and neutralize her. Gorath's massive features showed confusion. With that level of intelligence, the elimination should have been straightforward. Jenko's expression grew grim. That's what I believed. I had never failed to eliminate a target, regardless of their skill or preparation. I was confident that superior equipment and experience would overcome any advantages she might possess. He paused, his cybernetic systems processing what appeared to be painful memories. I tracked Staff Sergeant Park for 2 weeks, learning her patterns and identifying optimal engagement opportunities. She operated with remarkable discipline, but I eventually located her primary position on a ridge overlooking the main Caltharian supply route. The display showed topographical maps with multiple sniper positions marked in red. I established overwatch from a position 3 kilometers away, using advanced targeting systems that could compensate for atmospheric interference, gravitational variation, and target movement prediction. I had every technological advantage available. Kurath's tentacles writhed with anticipation. What happened when you engaged? I never had the opportunity, Jenko replied. As I prepared to take the shot, Staff Sergeant Park stood up from her concealed position, turned toward my location, and waved. The simple statement carried implications that chilled the room. She knew I was there, Velter said quietly. She had known for days, Jenko confirmed. While I thought I was hunting her, she had been tracking my movements and preparing her own counter-operation. She had identified my position, analyzed my equipment capabilities, and developed a plan to neutralize me. Dr. Sectos made a sound of disbelief. How could she detect you from 3 kilometers away? Jenko manipulated the display to show detailed technical specifications. Humans have developed passive detection methods that don't rely on active sensors or energy emissions. They study environmental changes, behavioral patterns, probability mathematics. Staff Sergeant Park had identified my presence by analyzing which positions would offer optimal firing angles for someone with my equipment and tactical preferences. The methodology was alien to the Mercenaries' understanding of warfare. They were accustomed to technology-based detection systems that could be countered with superior technology. She had calculated where I would position myself based on my professional history and the tactical requirements of the engagement, Jenko continued. Then, she had modified her own operations to draw me into the optimal position for her counterattack. Zykst felt his exoskeleton crawling with familiar unease. She manipulated your tactical decisions. She engineered the entire engagement, Jenko replied. Every move I made, every position I chose, every piece of equipment I deployed had been predicted and incorporated into her plan. His cybernetic eye dimmed as he accessed deeper archive files. After she waved at me, Staff Sergeant Park activated a communication system and invited me to a conversation. She spoke perfect Caltharian military dialect and addressed me by my professional designation. The fact that she knew his identity wasn't surprising given the pattern that had emerged from the other stories, but the casual way she had initiated contact suggested a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She explained that human military intelligence had been studying my career for months, Jenko continued. They knew about my previous eliminations, my tactical preferences, my equipment specifications, my psychological profile. Gorath leaned back in his massive chair. They had prepared specifically for your involvement. They had prepared for the involvement of any sniper with my capabilities, Jenko corrected. Staff Sergeant Park told me that human analysts had identified 12 different scenarios under which the Caltharians might hire external specialists to eliminate their problematic sniper. The scope of the preparation was staggering. The humans had not only anticipated that they might be targeted by professional assassins, but had developed specific countermeasures for different types of threats. She offered to demonstrate the extent of their preparation, Jenko continued. Over the next hour, she provided me with detailed information about my personal history, my training, my equipment, my previous contracts, even my financial arrangements with various employers. Kureth made a sound of amazement. They had compiled a complete intelligence profile. More than that, Jenko said. Staff Sergeant Park knew things about my past that weren't in any official records. She knew about training exercises I had completed, about modifications I had made to my equipment, about personal relationships I had maintained. His cybernetic systems displayed data that showed the depth of human intelligence gathering. But the most disturbing part wasn't what she knew about my past, Jenko continued. It was what she predicted about my future. She told me exactly what would happen during our engagement. The room fell silent as the mercenaries waited for him to continue. She explained that I would attempt to withdraw from the engagement and reposition for a better shooting angle. She predicted which route I would take, which defensive positions I would use, and how long it would take me to reach each waypoint. Velter shook her head in disbelief. She predicted your tactical retreat. She predicted my entire operational sequence, Jenko replied. Then she offered me a choice. I could attempt to continue the engagement, in which case she would demonstrate that her predictions were accurate, or I could withdraw from the operation, and she would provide me with information that would change my perspective on the conflict. The familiar pattern of human psychological manipulation was emerging once again. Dr. Sectos gestured with his 4 arms in recognition. She offered you the same choice the others received, he observed. With one significant difference, Jenko said grimly. She also told me that if I chose to continue the engagement, I would not survive the encounter. The threat was delivered without emotion or bravado, but as a simple statement of tactical reality. I chose to test her predictions, Jenko continued. I attempted to withdraw using counter-surveillance techniques that should have made tracking impossible. Advanced camouflage, electromagnetic dampening, movement patterns designed to confuse automated targeting systems. His cybernetic eye whirred as it accessed tactical recordings. Every prediction she had made was accurate. As I moved through each position she had identified, I encountered evidence that she had already prepared countermeasures. Sensor packages to track my movement, obstacles positioned to channel me into predetermined routes, even supplies cached to support extended observation. The level of preparation suggested that Staff Sergeant Park had been planning for this engagement weeks or months in advance. At the 3rd position, I realized that continuing the engagement would be suicidal, Jenko admitted. Her preparations were so thorough that I was essentially moving through a controlled environment designed to neutralize my advantages. Gorath's scarred features showed grudging respect. You chose to withdraw. I chose to learn, Jenko replied. I contacted Staff Sergeant Park and accepted her offer of information exchange. What she showed me changed my understanding of the entire conflict. He manipulated the display to show communication intercepts and financial records. The Centauri conflict wasn't a legitimate military engagement, Jenko continued. It was a manufactured war designed to test weapons and tactics that various galactic powers wanted to evaluate under combat conditions. The revelation struck the mercenaries like a physical blow. They had all participated in conflicts that they had believed were driven by genuine political or territorial disputes. The Caltharian Military Council was being paid by weapons manufacturers to field-test new military technologies, Jenko explained. The human forces were defending civilian populations that had been deliberately placed in danger to create realistic combat scenarios. Kureth's tentacles writhed with agitation. The entire war was a testing ground. Multiple conflicts were being orchestrated simultaneously to provide data on different combat environments, Jenko confirmed. Desert warfare, urban combat, void battles, siege operations. Each scenario was designed to evaluate specific weapon systems under controlled conditions. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Thousands of beings had died to provide research data for military contractors. Staff Sergeant Park provided me with evidence of the conspiracy, Jenko continued. Communication records between military leaders and corporate executives, financial transfers that funded the artificial conflicts, casualty projections that treated deaths as acceptable research costs. Dr. Sectos made a sound that his translator rendered as horror. They had calculated acceptable losses for their research. They had calculated optimal losses, Genko corrected. Enough casualties to provide meaningful data, but not so many that galactic authorities would investigate too closely. The mercenaries sat in stunned silence as they absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. But Staff Sergeant Park offered me more than just evidence, Genko said. She offered me the opportunity to help expose the conspiracy, not through violence or sabotage, but through precision intelligence operations. His cybernetic systems hummed as they processed complex data sets. The operation required me to eliminate specific targets, but not to kill them. Instead, I would need to disable communication systems, destroy financial records, and neutralize security personnel using non-lethal methods. The technical challenges of such an operation would have been staggering. Precision targeting to disable rather than destroy required skills that most snipers never developed. Staff Sergeant Park spent 3 weeks training me in human non-lethal engagement techniques, Genko continued. She taught me to use my precision skills for surgical strikes against infrastructure rather than personnel. Velter leaned forward with interest. She trained you to fight like a human. She taught me to think like a human, Genko corrected. To see conflicts as systems that could be disrupted rather than enemies that needed to be killed. To understand that sometimes the most effective shot is the one that disables a communication relay instead of eliminating a soldier. His cybernetic eye focused on each of his fellow mercenaries in turn. The operation was successful, he said. We gathered evidence that led to the arrest of 43 executives from 7 different weapons manufacturers. The artificial conflicts were shut down, the surviving participants were compensated for their suffering, and new galactic laws were established to prevent similar conspiracies. Zykes realized that there was still one crucial part of the story that hadn't been explained. Your cybernetic modifications, he said. How did you sustain such extensive damage? Genko's expression grew distant. During the final phase of the operation, I was detected by Caltharian security forces. They didn't know about my change of allegiance and assumed I was conducting a standard assassination mission. He gestured toward his cybernetic components. The explosion that should have killed me destroyed 70% of my organic systems. But Staff Sergeant Park had anticipated this possibility. Human medical teams were standing by with cybernetic replacement technology that was more advanced than anything available through normal military channels. The revelation completed the pattern. Once again, the humans had demonstrated the ability to predict not just immediate tactical decisions, but long-term consequences and contingencies. She had known that I would be injured during the operation, Genko continued. She had prepared medical resources to ensure my survival and had arranged for cybernetic enhancements that would make me more effective than I had been before. His mechanical components hummed softly as they processed the memory. Staff Sergeant Park visited me during my recovery. She told me that human military analysts had calculated a 67% probability that I would sustain life-threatening injuries during our collaboration. They had prepared for my medical needs before recruiting me. The room fell silent as the full implications of the story settled over the mercenaries. That's when I realized the fundamental truth about fighting humans, Genko concluded. They don't just predict what we will do, they predict what will happen to us when we do it. They plan for our success, our failure, our injuries, our psychological trauma even.